design on your computer?
Oh, yeah.
And are you Macs or PCs or both? Mac all the way around?
Yeah.
No? Okay.
There's always one.
And for the one that's not on a Mac, what do you use to record your music, or how do you interact with the computer?
I don't yet.
You don't? Okay. And for those that have Macs, are you using Logic or Pro Tools or what? Pro Tools. And are you manipulating? Are you manipulating sound or editing or deep? Is it like a DJ kind of thing, or are you actually doing multi-track recordings of your bands, or layering?
Yeah.
Okay. So do you use the computer as a means to compose music? Okay. And how much sound design have you gotten into? Do you have a little bit of understanding of like synthesis and how sound lives in the world, physics of acoustics, physics of sound, reverb units? Anybody play with reverb?
Love reverb.
Vocalists love reverb. Always. So, well, my background is kind of a hybrid. I actually I have a music degree. I play the guitar. I play the keyboards very poorly, as Lyle could attest to.
No, he's lying. He's
And,
his own thing.
And but when I got out of school, I went to Cal State Long Beach, and when I got out of school, I had a really bizarre bit of luck, and I got a job working for Frank Zappa. Does anybody know who Frank Zappa is?
Yeah.
A lot of you know his music? Yeah. I worked on a machine called the Synclavier because I was very, very interested in computer music. And so he needed a guy basically to maintain that machine, and it was right at the edge, right when digital sampling became kind of, it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was affordable. It was a $750,000 machine. And these guys had one in the Papathini group. And Frank had one with just a handful of people. Stevie Wonder, I think, and Sting. There's just very, very few people that could afford to get involved in any of this. And which was my premise going out to find a job after music school, was I figured anybody who could afford to buy it couldn't possibly have the time to learn how to run it. And that kind of proved to be true. So when I got to Zappa's, he said basically that I was to maintain the machine, and I did a lot of sound design work on the machine. And when we got the sampling option for it, I went out into the world and I sampled everything I could record and turned it into an instrument for him. And the result of that was a few records, arguably the last few records that he had in his lifetime, were predominantly computer music. He wasn't writing for a band, he was writing for that computer. So he would write the most ridiculous music, ridiculously unplayable by most mortals. And he was very interested in very, very complicated rhythms, and hearing them played precisely. And in some cases, even the computer didn't play it correctly. But we did a few records. One of them was called Jazz from Hell. One of them was called Frank Zappa Meets the Mothers of Prevention. And then the last record that he put out was called Civilization, Lumpy Gravy Phase 3, which was a collage of a lot of things. But it was kind of the crowning effort of all the computer music stuff that he was involved in. And he kind of turned me more into a technician, and it was at a time when there was a realization that these computers and synthesizers were becoming kind of regular parts of music production, and but they were getting very complicated because you had, in the case of Korg and Yamaha, you had engineers that sometimes had absolutely no musical background whatsoever. They had an engineering background, a computer engineering background, so the user interfaces for operating these things were very, very complicated, and they weren't necessarily written or geared for somebody who had a music background to understand how to get around it. So I've been kind of, since that period of time, which was about 85, I think, 84 or something when I went to Zappa's, I kind of created a job for myself as being kind of an intermediary between very deep computer technology applied to music and sound and the composer. So, which is what our collaboration has been for the last 7 years,
Yeah.
something like that. So that's why I'm here. and I'm going to continue to work. But we were going to talk today about the use of synthesizers in orchestrating music, and it's a shared idea between Lyle and I that we can make instrument sounds that sound like they belong in the families of electroacoustic instruments or acoustic music, and that's something he's championed for many, many years and been one of the more successful people to pull it off, to make the point that synthesized sounds or imagined sounds can exist in the framework of acoustic music, and a lot of people in classical music or certainly folk music, many country music, they all kind of scoff at the idea of plugging anything in. So of course the famous Newport Folk Festival, when Bob Dylan plugged his electric guitar and decided, that's what he wanted to do. And Miles Davis shifted in his career a number of times, and a number of artists, just kind of changed their medium. Visual artists or fine artists also did the same thing. He just kind of up and decided to do something else. And it was important for Bob Dylan to do that. Of course, it started kind of this huge revolution among people that were known for protest and standing up with their fists. But eventually, it won over, and there's a lot of wonderful folk music and music that comes out of Nashville and that employs electric instruments and acoustic instruments equally. It's just a sound that we're used to hearing now. But there definitely was a change. There definitely was a shift.
So along that point, I felt lucky to have grown up in an era where that shift was actually taking place. And I think you feel the same way. We lived through this bit of history where the world went from essentially acoustic music with a few amplified instruments, but essentially an acoustic instrument world, to an amplified instrument world, to synthesized and eventually computer-controlled and kind of anything world. I mean, the last 50 years have been amazing. But as a high school student, I snuck Frank Zappa records into my house, played them when parents weren't home because of the occasional F-bomb or whatever. But I was profoundly influenced by that music. That was just part of what was going on. I was certainly aware of the Dylan concert. But prior to that, I suppose as someone interested in jazz, I was aware of this, what I would call a false dichotomy. The start of tension between acoustic jazz and amplified jazz, or even a traditional jazz and another style of jazz. And I view all these sort of debates with a little bit of skepticism. There have always been people who want to set up one camp against another camp. And my history in the music business has been about breaking down those barriers and ignoring the debates and just say acoustic or electric, why not acoustic and electric? Composed or improvised, why not composed and improvised? And I think that framework still applies to what we're doing today. With all the choices you guys have for sound design, sound enhancement, sound recording, sound creation, we have all these tools in the world, and my particular feeling is both and. Whatever, an acoustic sound along with an electric sound, along with a sample sound, along with a created sound.
And ambience.
Yes.
Take the sound of the world into your music.
So the starting point, I would say, is beware of the false dichotomies. And whatever the dilemma of your age, know that those dilemmas have been going on forever. And they usually get resolved by most people shrugging their shoulders and just making music that's cool. The particular politics of any particular style. Style is a tricky thing. They come and go, and they're never the most important element of music. We don't listen to Beethoven because it was written in the style of the day. We listen to it because it's bad. It's just happening. And it survived the test of time, not because of the style it was written in. So to get back to the dawn of this sort of synthesizer era, my first real break, and continues to be my gig in the music world, is playing with Pat Metheny. We put together the Pat Metheny group in late '77, and right from the start, the founding premise of that was a combination of acoustic and electric. Acoustic piano and electric guitar was the starting point of the sound of that band. And what had been considered possibly a problem in jazz, the two rhythm section instruments, guitar and piano, we turned into virtues by writing specifically for that combination of sounds. And shortly, right at the time that the Pat Metheny group started, the first polyphonic synthesizer came out, the Oberheim 4-voice. Prior to that, there had been synths out there, but they were either of the patch cord variety, like you guys have probably seen pictures. You may even have similar things here. The ARP 2600, I think? Was that the big, Bob, was that the
ARP 2600 was in the first electronic music studio. Do you guys spend time in the electronic music studio here? Did any of you use that studio? A couple people? Or maybe you're just nodding away. You're just waking up a little. The electronic music studio that Marcus has set up here is one of the best and most well-populated synthesizer studios I've ever seen in my life.
It's astounding.
And where the technology that you have access to has come from were huge rooms. Did you ever go to the electronic music labs? Probably at UNT, which basically were these huge steel racks that might have a huge box that was an oscillator, and it produced a sine wave. It produced a very, very simple sound, and it had a gigantic big knob on it. And I used to say to Frank when we would run into crashes and things on the computer, I said, why can't we go back to the days of the big knob, But they would have a couple of, right? I feel like it today.
Yeah.
But they had like 3 of those huge boxes with oscillators, and then they had some dedicated filters that might just sweep a bandpass filter or something. So it's essentially this gigantic thing that's the equivalent of a wah-wah pedal if you're a guitar player. And it was something that simple, but the technology was so primitive, it took a lot of real estate to pull that together. But at that time, you understood, and then there were amplifiers and gigantic JBL speakers, and And that was an electronic music studio with a couple of tape recorders. And you would go back and you would put down one ridiculously simple layer of oscillators, you know, and mess with the filter or something, and you know what we call bloop bleep music,
Yeah.
to some extent, and then you would have to go back and figure out either bounce from that mono recorder to another recorder so you could layer another sound on it, and bounce and bounce and bounce and bounce until you had a number of layers to. So all the Pro Tools that you have is the work of decades of innovation in terms of recording technology, and it's very easy. And it's a lot of people say it, it's very, very easy for anybody to make a record in their bedroom. And the problem now is that pretty much everybody does it. And the music sometimes suffers as a result of that lack of experience or lack of understanding of what the experience is of going out and playing with other live musicians and understanding how your part interacts with the part of another, or the famous, the great one about a piano player and a guitar player playing together often play chords in the same range. And if you play guitar with a piano player for a while, you learn to get out of his way. You kind of learn to get out of his way, and you move your chords up and register a little bit. And that speaks to the idea of orchestrating your music, or organizing, you know, how the structure of a chord or a passage of music, what's the density, how the lowest note and the highest note, and what goes in between, and what instruments, what are those sounds that you build to make these layers. And some of them work. There's some very obvious things that we learned from Beethoven and Ravel and Debussy and
Frank.
And Frank, who tried a lot of different kinds of combinations of sounds.
Well, along these lines, if we're talking about orchestration, we can go, really that's in the category of sound design. And before recording, the composers were doing that all acoustically. The weight of a particular section, how many instruments were doubling apart, who was the soloist, who played when, who was playing out. The balances were done in the score, and it was all done with acoustic instruments. So what this modern era has given us is the chance to do sonic environments as well as the orchestration. So we can have instruments playing together, but we can put those instruments in artificial spaces, or we can have them appear in different places just in the stereo.
Space, I guess. How do you come up with a progression, or what do you expand your vocabulary?
Good questions. I would say that the primary way that I grew as a composer, coming from a jazz background, was to stop writing for jazz bands, to write chamber music, where the notes themselves had to provide all the drama, all the propulsion, they had to do all the heavy lifting. So for anyone with a jazz background, I recommend doing chamber writing. And for anyone with a classical background, I recommend playing in a rock band. Just get a feel for getting people off. Because you need a balance of knowledge of all your tools, but also a sense of what it's like for a listener to be trying to follow along. In terms of harmony in particular, I'm a huge fan of the Impressionists, Debussy and Ravel, but that came from being a Bill Evans fan and reading interviews where Bill would talk about how he was influenced by those guys. And the more I go back and study that stuff, the more I'm convinced that that harmonic music, there's still tonal harmonic music to be made. We don't have to throw out tonality. We don't have to go to a 12-tone system or all of that. So the very best of Bartók and Stravinsky and even Baird sounds tonal to me. Even some of the stuff that Baird was writing under a 12-tone system, it still sounded like ear music to me. kind of thick, but so basically, I go to the tradition for knowledge and inspiration, but in terms of specific progressions, there's two ways to go about it. And often in the jazz world, we're taught kind of root progression tonal traditions. I mean, part of that starts from the blues, but even all the chestnuts like Autumn Leaves or whatever, there's such a kind of tyranny of the key. So if you're in one key, you're going to, and maybe you have something outside the key, but you have a 2-5-1 going back to the key. So the first thing that I want to explore is getting away from that tyranny of the root position movements. So for a few years, I would explore a tune like, say, Stella by Starlight, doing nothing but inversions. So. Just what those specific verticals were. And then later on I started realizing that that maybe is all I need. That I started realizing maybe that intervallic play then I got away from chordal thinking altogether, and I was looking at what the actual specific notes were doing. And there's a passage in this excerpt where the progression what's happening there is this notion of like a G half diminished, not going, separating the functionality of the half diminished from its tendency to go to a key, and just treating it as a world, maybe. Like perhaps Debussy would just treat that as just a place to hang out in for a while, color. So that thinking of that's just a place to be, followed by intervallic manipulation. What happens if I take this chord, and instead of thinking of it as a G minor half diminished chord, I think of it as a pair of intervals. So I have the G and the B flat there, and I have the D flat and the F here. If I move this half of it parallel, all of a sudden I'm thinking differently. I'm thinking of chromatic motions. So all of a sudden there's now a harmonic motion that's created not from functional thinking, but from intervallic thinking and voice-leading thinking. It's a different approach. It's harder to write that way. It takes longer. You're taking some of the crutches out from under you. You can't just put a 2-5-1 in if you're committed to a path that's dealing more with intervals. But it's a personal journey for me to try to understand harmony to the point that I can have alternate ways of using the tools. Sorry, it's a long-winded way. It's too open-ended to try to summarize. So that's just a few random examples of some of the things that I do.
Was there somebody here for that?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I really feel like asking some of the stuff he was talking about in you, but I guess there's not much time. As a piano player, when you go in between those two, an acoustic instrument and an electric instrument, you've been talking about the things that that both worlds kind of offer you. But do you feel like you're losing something whenever you're jumping from acoustic to electric, or from electric to acoustic? And if that's the case, what would you do? Like, where would you go whenever you're feeling in a certain way, or whenever you want to write something, or that? No.
Well, I think you're getting to something that's really interesting. I mean, there are just definitely trade-offs.
Yeah.
You can get effects from a string section that you can't from a woodwind quintet.
Right.
And at a certain point, I like to think of this whole sonic world that's available to us now as just more orchestrational possibilities. So instead of saying, you know, what do I lose when I do this, it's more like, what can this add to the picture? So I've tended to have acoustic elements in everything I've done. I don't think that we're anywhere near replacing acoustic instruments. I think that they're here to stay. And I think with any of the increase in technology, there may be at first a tendency to think that this is a replacement technology, but what we consistently discover as a society that we're just adding things to the palette. Remember ads for the Hammond organ in the late 50s that were saying that, you know, this could replace all the instruments of the orchestra because you could theoretically dial in any overtone series with these tone bars and you wouldn't need a clarinet anymore because you could just, you know, well, that's not how people use the Hammond organ. It didn't replace clarinets, it didn't replace trumpets, but that was missing the point. It wasn't replacement technology. I mean, the Hammond organ found its way into gospel churches, into rock bands, into jazz bands. It's you know, every sample library we have has organ sounds, and there's, what was it, B4? That's the modeling environment.
Native Instruments B4. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a viable. We just added a musical instrument to the party. When synth first came out, there were all musicians union members were complaining it was going to like end the practice of live music, and there was panic in the streets. And it didn't replace instruments. I mean, maybe some of the lamer players stopped getting hired, but they were going to probably stop getting hired anyway. I mean, the really savvy guys just got some synth chops, and they, you know, and they were playing EWIs or amplifying their sound with the technology. And then when digital synths came out, people were saying, oh, we're done with analog. We'll never have analog synths. And they were absolutely wrong. We still have a need for that kind of sound. So what I see just in my short lifetime is that the Hammond organ didn't replace anything. It got added. I was try to create some of the sounds that previously I had to just write parts for and wait for a rehearsal and then suffer through a bad performance and then go back home and modify the parts. So to actually have a synth that could kind of create a flute sound or a clarinet kind of sound or a string section kind of sound just gave me all kinds of possibilities. But these days, if you have access to any kind of laptop, I'm a big fan of the sequencer environment as a compositional tool. I think it's just it's to the point now where I do all my composing in a sequencer environment. It allows me to create ensembles of any size. And these days with software synthesis, you have you know, an unlimited sort of array of sound possibilities. But maybe you're asking a different question. Maybe you're asking more about how to reduce the possibilities to get something manageable to compose. I'm not sure which aspect you're coming at this from. You want to clarify for me?
Well, kind of just what you just said, pretty much.
How do you start to get interested, or how do you get access to it? Go to a junior college.
Yeah.
Right. So step one,
That's
you
what
nailed
I
it.
did. I mean, the synth lab, if you see the curriculum that he set up, we just walked into that room for the first time. There's terminals, and there's a very simple, any Macintosh computer now. Actually, any Macintosh computer has a program on it called GarageBand, which is a very simple entry-level drug. you know, to you know, it's a gateway drug to get into all this huge orchestration.
But I think, you know, to be, you know, knowing some of the guys in here, I think, you know, everybody's waiting for that magic pill, you know, that eventually somebody tells them, well, this is how easy it is. But everybody forgets that it's really a lot of trial and error, and it's just spending, you know, thousands of hours on an instrument and just, you know, trying it by trial and error to see, you know, what is your personal language. I mean, I would assume that nobody has told you and Pat at the age of 22, well, this is how you have to do it. Otherwise, you know, they wouldn't develop a signature sound. I mean, Beethoven didn't come, you know, to imitate somebody else. He eventually created his own stuff by trial and error, I would assume.
Right. That brings up some interesting points too about how do you get into it, because there are a number of ways to get into this world of sound design. I mean, I'm coming at it from a compositional element standpoint, and also as someone who learned to play an instrument at an early age, so as a performer. But a good friend of mine got into being a record producer and an engineer from a background in fixing gear. He was a technician at a studio, and he took that as an entry point into messing around with the parameters of these boxes that he had in his back room, and turned that into expertise with the outdoor gear, and turned that into a knowledge of the consoles and the rest of the gear in the room, and expertise with the sonic world, and discovered a musical talent and a real artistry through the sort of instrument repair entryway. So there's all kinds of ways to get into it. If you're interested in music at any level, I encourage you first to identify in the existing records or stuff that's out there what there is about it. Read interviews with those people, see if you can find out what their influences are, or try to ask yourself a bunch of questions about why you like this music. Get real specific. It's like, why do I like that measure? What is there that happens here? Is it that the drums get louder? Is it that the drums go away? Is it that there's no drums at all? Like, ask yourself a lot of the more specific questions you can ask yourself about the stuff you like, the more information you'll get about where you need to go. And that's off the top of my head, that's the first thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with a lot of people, and everybody has a different way of approaching these things. There's no real one path, and I mean, maybe if you're a violinist, there's a Suzuki method of violin, you know, learning how to play the violin, and some people subscribe to that faith, you know, and the way. You know, the way if you want to play around with music production tools, get them and play with them, you know. But the overwhelming feeling that I got when I walked up into that lab was, I mean, that's just light years beyond what I had access to. But the fact of the matter is, I started on the exact same synthesizer he started on. It was a little Oberheim, and it was very simple, and it was very contained. And it had 1 million dials on it, which of course was, you know, extremely attractive to me. You know, you got to get in and turn all those dials and figure out what they do, and see if you can make any sound out of it. I have a friend of mine who has a synthesizer rental company in L.A., and it's called SST, and he had an ARP 2600, which was a hybrid, but it was basically a modular synthesizer. And it had so many dials on it, and it had a bunch of patch points, and it was the synthesizer that Stevie Wonder played on the Intervisions record, and Joe Zawinul played it and got many wonderful sounds out of it. But my friend had it sitting in the lobby of his synthesizer rental studio, and he had a little sign on it that said, "If you can make a sound on this thing, you can have it for free for a day." You know, because you had to come into that room knowing a little about. You can't just go in there and turn it on like this thing, and it goes into some freakazoid mode and annoys your stabber, as it just did. You know, it's, you know, where we came from, we had simpler tools.
Well, Margaret, what's the the course where the students start with the reactor and learn how to, is it reactor that?
Well, I mean, basically, it's very simple. Once somebody sees the basic elements of the most simple synths, really from the left to the right, an oscillator, here's some type of an envelope generator, here's a few filters that you can use, and here's somewhat of an end result that you can still influence with a low frequency oscillator, whatever you can do. Then everybody gets to see the hardware copies that we have in the analog lab, and then they can open their respective reactor ensemble and just play around with it. Because somebody like you may come up with a completely different result that you like, that I would dial in if I play around with it, because everybody probably hears a texture completely different, or prefers a certain lead sound. And a Euro dance producer goes definitely for different sounds than you would like, or I would like, because I like analog sounding, fat type of sounding, kind of pitch envelope shaped sounds that interfit or interact with an acoustic environment. And that may be not what you choose, but essentially, I mean, there's so many tools on these things that it's even beyond me sometimes to do.
To go back to the original question, how you start is it's critical to understand the concept of signal path. And I started playing guitar, and I was pretty young when I got my first electric guitar. And the guitar my older brother got me had a fuzz tone built into it. And it made one sound, and it was crunchy and awful, and I loved it. And then of course that made me want.
I can hear the bleed from the home, so I apologize to you guys. But anyway, I wanted to play a little bit of that piece because this is the combination of kind of all the stuff we've been talking about, and this piece is the next thing I'm going to record. It's going to be with some classical musicians playing marimba and vibes and percussion. It goes on into other sections. There's the whole drum set part that comes in later. But the sonic world that this sequence is hopefully indicating for you guys is this blend of all these acoustic and electric instruments. Again, the concept of the waves of sound, where you hear at the very core, instead of a drum loop or a drum set played live, creating this basic pattern, we have this web of eighth notes played on the marimba and the Rhodes. And that creates a kind of rhythmic horizon line. And in and out of that, the soloistic lines of the piano poke their heads out. Other sort of modern omnisphere kind of sounds are creating little comments on that world. But it's still the notion of the soundscape created by layers and waves of sound is still there. I want to get back to the questions too, to see if we've got one more thing that we want to do, but see if you guys have any more questions and want to open it up for Bob too. Anything? Yes.
When you go out on the road, how long does it take you to get together all your patches and all your sounds and have them organized? Like, what's that process like?
It's very interesting. I try to create as many environments ahead of time that I know I'm going to use. I used to use an Apple computer on, what was it, System 7 that was the most stable for an old program called OMS Setup and Patches, I think. It was designed to work with a Studio 5, which of course is a box not made, software that's not made anymore, a platform that's not made anymore. Now I'm trying to work in the digital performer environment, just using chunks. And having patch changes at the start of a chunk, so that sets things up. And that works well for a lot of applications. I can use the multi-record mode in Performer to get different keyboards to control different combinations of things. Essentially, I do as much work ahead of time as I can think to do. I get basic environment set up where there's a pad played from a certain register of the piano. And I've been lucky enough to have a MIDI piano for most of the last couple of decades. But there's always things that happen once the tour starts, so it's an evolving process. And I'd say it's through the first week or maybe in the first 2 weeks. There's still changes that are made to the environment. But we've done pre-production stuff at the house. I mean, there's a lot of it.
It depends really how complicated the tour is. The last tour he did with the Pat Metheny group was for a piece called The Way Up that had an incredible array of sounds, but a good many of them were guitar-related, guitar sounds and combinations of acoustic stringed instruments and electric stringed instruments. And you had somewhat of, I mean, you had a lot of changes, but you had somewhat of a limited